Let's head live to Ottawa and Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre.
Ryan Telford ainsi que Michael Barrett, notre porte-parole en matière d'éthique. What a great corruption-busting champion we have in Eastern Ontario with Michael Barrett. Thank you for all your hard work holding this government to account and tirelessly pointing out and exposing Liberal waste and corruption and Mark Carney's unprecedented conflicts of interest. Before I go into what I'm going to announce, let me talk about why I'm going to announce it. The reason that it's important not to have government corruption, conflicts of interest, and rampant waste is because the people always pay the price. When politicians get rich by making everyone else poor, waitresses and welders, truck drivers, and barbers end up.
Now I'm in my 50s, I'm all about making the right choices, like eating right and staying healthy. And another thing I can choose is how to look after my family if anything ever happened to me.
Welcome to Senior's Choice, the #1 direct choice for Canadians over 50. How can I help?
Hi, I'd like a quick quote for Canadians.
That the lost Liberal decade drove the cost of housing and food up and drove your wages and living standards down. The crime and chaos are overtaking our once safe streets. He wants you to forget that Liberal insiders like him have profited richly off of the misery of everyone else. He wants you to forget that Canada has had the worst housing inflation in the G7, the worst economic growth in the G7, the worst household debt in the G7, that $500 billion has left Canada for the Americans because of the economic policies Mr. Carney advised Trudeau to implement. He wants you to forget all of that. But he also wants you to forget that while Canadians were suffering, he and Liberal insiders were getting rich. They were benefiting off of the suffering. This is because of very powerful conflicts of interest that remain in place today and which Mr. Carney refuses to answer for. But let's just chronicle the corruption that we have witnessed in the last 10 years of the Liberals. Prime Minister Trudeau was found twice guilty of violating the Ethics Act, taking illegal vacations and interfering in corporate prosecutions. We know that the Green Slush Fund saw $1 billion largely handed out to government insiders, where the board members who handed out the money were also invested in the companies that got the money. Then there was the Arrive scam, a useless app no one needed that cost hundreds of times more than necessary and in the end didn't work, and no one was held accountable. The amount of money now spent on government contractors has gone up by well over 100% in a decade, to over $20 billion. Roughly $1,400 per family is spent in federal taxes to fund consultants. Now, if you think for a second that this Liberal corruption is going to change with a fourth Liberal term headed by Mark Carney, sadly, you'd be exactly wrong. In fact, Mark Carney brings even more conflicts of interest. He's invested in a company that has money stashed away, billions of dollars stashed in overseas tax havens. He has a company that is in debt to the Chinese government-backed bank to the tune of $250 million. His company profited by his personal interventions to get handouts for investments they made in jet fuel and heat pumps. Now, his big solution to the Liberal housing crisis is that he wants the government to build prefabricated tiny homes. Well, his company is invested in prefabricated tiny homes. Clearly, this is not about helping young people own their own home. It's about filling the pockets of his investors and himself. Mr. Carney refuses to tell Canadians what investments he continues to own or even where he pays his taxes. This means that when he's sitting around the cabinet table making decisions, his personal interest will be against Canada's national interest. We need change. Change so you can afford a home. Change so you can afford food. Change so your paycheck rises faster than your cost of living. Change so you have safe streets and crime-free communities again. Change so you can be confident that your government is working for you, not for wealthy insiders or for the politicians who are making the decisions. La raison pour laquelle M. Carney se cache aujourd'hui, c'est parce qu'il veut vous faire oublier.
Is because he wants to make you forget that the cost of housing doubled during the Liberal years, that the cost of food has skyrocketed, and that your paycheck is lower while many costs are up. He wants to make you forget the lost Liberal decade, when the cost of housing and groceries has doubled, waiting lines at food banks have doubled, and inflation has grown 36% more here in Canada than in the U.S. And we've had the worst economic growth in the G7, the worst family debt in the G7, and the worst in real estate inflation in the G7. That's the lost Liberal decade. He does not want to defend the record that he advised Justin Trudeau to implement, nor defend the scandals around his own conflicts of interest. If we choose to elect the Liberals for a fourth term, we will have higher costs, higher crime, and higher corruption. But we can change with a new Conservative government that will cut taxes, unleash our entrepreneurs to build homes and produce our natural resources, make us more independent from the Americans. We can have a new government that will make our politicians and government accountable.
We had a Conservative government. We were on the heels of a lot of other Liberal scandal. Who could forget the sponsorship scandal? We came to office promising an Accountability Act, and we delivered. We passed laws forcing more disclosure of government information, banning conflicts of interest, cracking down on insiders, setting up the lobbyist registry so that we knew who was paid to influence government decisions. And it worked for a while until Liberals found loopholes. We have to give them credit. They're very creative. As much as we tried to stomp out all the Liberal corruption, they went to work to find ways around the rules. So I'm announcing today that a new Conservative government will bring change by introducing the Accountability Act 2.0, designed to remove the loopholes that Mr. Carney and the Liberals are using to avoid accountability for themselves and for their party. We're going to put Canadians first for a change. We're going to have an accountable government for a change. We're going to have politicians and leaders who work for you, for your affordable home and food, for your safe street, for your paycheck, for a change. So let me lay out some of the elements of this plan. First, we will ban shadow lobbying. Now, shadow lobbying is when professional VIPs with big shot titles call themselves advisors so that they can influence government decisions to profit themselves, but then get around lobbying rules. And Mr. Carney's been famous for this. He bragged that he lobbied the British government to increase jet fuel prices while his company invested in the jet fuel. He brags that he influenced governments to subsidize heat pumps while his company invests in heat pumps. He says that he's going to reverse the Liberal housing crisis by having the government build prefab tiny homes. Well, his company is invested in prefab tiny homes. Using a fake title of advisor to push policies that enrich yourself while impoverishing everyone else is an unacceptable conflict of interest, and it is nothing more than glorified corporate lobbying that is unregistered. We have a lobbyist registry which is meant to allow Canadians to know who is taking money to influence government decisions. We cannot allow high-priced corporate insiders like Mark Carney to go around those rules. And so, henceforth, we will eliminate the lobbying loophole and require anyone who's acting as an advisor to government officials to declare themselves and register as a lobbyist whenever they are advising on matters that touch upon their financial interests or that of their company. This would have required Mr. Carney register as a lobbyist when he was talking about anything that would have profited his corporate interests at Brookfield. Second, we will stop politicians from profiting off their own decisions. Ministers should not be involved in setting policies that enrich themselves or their families without accountability. We should not allow people to use their political power in government to make decisions that will advantage themselves above and beyond the public interest. Let me explain the problem. There is a section in the Ethics Act right now that allows a politician to make a decision that benefits him or his family if it benefits other people as well. Now, the reason that was set up was so that, for example, Jim Flaherty benefited by cutting the GST because his consumer purchases were a little more affordable. But, of course, everybody benefited. We didn't want to declare that to be a conflict of interest. But it's been widely over-interpreted to allow, for example, Bill Morneau to make policies that affect insurance plans just because there are multiple companies that benefit from it and not just his. And so we will put in place a stricter test that will ban politicians, particularly ministers, from any involvement in decisions that would benefit their interests more than the public interest. They would also have to declare these interests publicly and widely so that everyone knows. Third, we'll increase the fines for ethics violations to $10,000. No more slaps on the wrist. 4, tax transparency. Anyone running for office will have to disclose where they paid taxes for the last 7 years. In which country? Interestingly, one reporter has contacted Mr. Carney's campaign and said, have you been paying taxes in Canada personally? And his campaign refuses to answer that question. Seems like a pretty basic question. He's the Prime Minister of Canada, and he can't tell a journalist whether he pays taxes in Canada, whether he personally pays the same taxes that he charges everyone else? This is, I've never seen something like this in my life. And then you have his corporate interests, where we know he has cash stashed in Bermuda, in the Caymans, and other of the most flagrant offshore tax havens. So while he was advising Justin Trudeau to raise your taxes, he was dodging his. He still has those conflicts in place. How would you ever trust him to reform the tax system to make it fairer when he benefits from dodging his bills? Waitresses, truck drivers, manual laborers have to pay a much higher tax rate than Mark Carney's company, and he remains in that conflict. So he should have to reveal where he's paid his tax for the last 7 years. 5th, we'll require cabinet ministers to divest fully from tax havens and disclose their assets to the Office of the Ethics Commissioner with penalties for non-compliance. No more so-called blind trusts that are only blind to the public. What does this mean? It means that when you're going into cabinet, including becoming Prime Minister, you would actually have to sell all the assets, turn it into cash, hand that cash over to a trustee who would then invest it from scratch, unbeknownst to you, so that you would not have any ability to know what interests you have that go against the public interest. Right now, Mr. Carney has handed over his Brookfield investments knowing they cannot be sold. So he knows exactly what he owns, but no one else does. And as a result, there is no blind trust when you know what's inside that trust. It is blind only to the public. He should have to sell and liquidate these investments and then have the cash reinvested without his knowledge, so that he could not possibly act in his own interest and against the Canadian interest. 6th, we'll require party leaders to disclose their assets within 30 days of becoming leader, or require the Prime Minister to divest their assets within 30 days of taking that job. Le dernier gouvernement conservateur sur lequel j'ai servi a introduit la loi fédérale sur la responsabilité pour mettre fin à la corruption libérale qui nous a apporté le scandale des commandites. J'étais le secrétaire parlementaire en passant qui a fait adopter cette loi au comité. Mais dès que les libéraux sont retournés au pouvoir, ils ont trouvé de nouvelles failles à exploiter et de nouveaux moyens d'échapper à cette loi. C'est pourquoi un nouveau gouvernement conservateur va présenter une nouvelle loi, la loi de responsabilité 2.0. Un plan pour mettre fin à la corruption au sein du gouvernement, éliminer les échappatoires qui profitent aux initiés comme Mark
You've been listening to Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative leader, talking about reintroducing an Accountability Act 2.0, which would ban shadow lobbying, among other things, also ban ministers from making decisions that they would benefit from. He's been speaking in Ottawa.